Brilliant. Okay, now we have our waters open. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us. I know there's an awful lot of competing panels at the minute, so really do appreciate you joining us for a discussion about AI and humanity, and I guess how we can keep humanity as AI slowly encroaches on us. My name is Chris Stokel-Walker. I'm a technology journalist for a number of publications in the UK, including Wired, The Economist, BBC, Bloomberg, and I'm joined by some really interesting contributors to our panel. So immediately to my left, I have Tracy Chu, who is the founder and CEO of Block Party, which is a London-based startup working on kind of rethinking social platforms. So Tracy was an engineer at Quora and Pinterest. She's, I believe, consulted with the US government as well, trying to keep them honest, which is always very nice. In the middle, we have Bridget Hyacinth, who is the founder and director of the NBA Caribbean organization. So that basically is trying to give leaders around the world a bit of a conscience and provoking some critical thinking, I think. She's also the author of a number of books on leadership. So very interesting contributor to our debate on the human side. And then on your right, we have Ora Netzioni, who is the CEO of the Allen Institute for Artificial Intelligence in Seattle. That was set up by Paul Allen, who is the co-founder of Microsoft in 2014. And it's basically developing AI for public good. So we are already biased, I think, probably, in that we want AI to be developed sustainably and well. But perhaps the best place to start, I mean, Tracy, what is it that separates AI from humanity, do you think, in this sort of thing? When you're developing intelligent platforms and using AI, what is it that's different from just humans involved in that?
Well, it's a big question to start with. One thing to clarify upfront might be what we actually mean by the term artificial intelligence or AI. And in some contexts, it is actually, when people are talking about AI, it is a very intelligent, super intelligent form of technology. And in many cases, the way it's used now in the industry is actually not so sophisticated. And so a lot of the AI that we're talking about in technology companies is, if you actually look at it, really basic mathematical models that take inputs like clicks and view time, and then tries to get people to click more and view more on these platforms. And so some of these AI models that are being used right now are not very intelligent. They're just training off of existing data that is not very smart. And what then happens is when we try to deploy this at scale, it is much faster than having humans look at, let's say, ranking what people should look at when they're logging into Facebook or Twitter, or what moderation decisions should be. So the AI is faster, but it's not actually more intelligent. And so what then ends up happening is that we have dumber decisions being made much more quickly at global scale.
And Oren, I mean, I know that you obviously are helping try and develop AI for the public good, but is that a fear amongst tech companies, is that they just want to throw AI at any problem without thinking about the long-term impact of it?
Well, first of all, I really like Tracy's characterization, because people do, and it comes, I think, largely from Hollywood, people do get an overinflated notion of what AI is. It's very much the next generation of computer technology. I like to say you have to separate science from science fiction and reality from Hollywood and hype, right? We've all seen movies like Her and Terminator and so on. Great movies, if you like that sort of thing, but it's not really what's happening. Now, Chris, to your question, I don't think we can paint everything with the same brush. So certainly the companies like Facebook and Google are using this algorithm to target advertising, to collect a large amount of data. They're doing that very effectively. A number of authorities like the Chinese, but also various forces inside the United States, use AI for facial recognition. And we're finding more and more that While Tracy is right that the algorithms are not particularly smart in any sense, when you have massive amounts of labeled data, millions of examples, and you have a lot of computational power, increasingly you can be accurate at least some of the time, and that leads to achievements at least in these narrow arenas. So then we get to the question, okay, what do we do with this? And I think all of us think that's a fascinating question. I've probably talked for too long already. I don't want to turn this into a soliloquy. Let me just say that my answer to that, it's not going to be one thing. Different players are going to be doing very, very different things with AI.
And Bridget, I mean, you spend your life trying to make company founders think sort of critically and intelligently and nicely almost. I mean, are you waking up in cold sweats at the idea of sort of the AI dawn coming upon us here?
I would say no. The reality is here, just like, electricity. And, as Oren was saying that, sometimes people focus on just the negatives, but there are a lot of positives, in the development of artificial intelligence. So, we can focus on that. What I really try to work with leaders is to bring back that human touch, that element. Um, I was raised by my mother, single parent, and 6 children. And because of people giving back, in the community, I'm able to be where I am today. So this is why I stress the leaders a lot. Even in this, technological age, we still have to have to keep that human touch, that caring aspect, that ability to give back. How do you leave a legacy? It's through inspiring, it's through helping others, it's through giving back. So we still have to balance, yes, the profits and the balance sheet, but also to make a lasting impact. And when you look, also when you look at how, take for example, right, if you look at sometimes on social media, when someone does a kind act, it goes immediately viral. When someone crosses an old lady the street, it goes viral. Why? Because it's not the norm. So things like kindness and empathy and compassion and generosity, it is not the norm and it should be. And this is what is going to differentiate us from AI.
That's really interesting. I should also say we do have Slido working for our panel, so if you want to ask us any questions, I have the joys of technology. It's not AI, but I have a little iPad that will feed in some of those questions. That's really fascinating, Bridget. So, I mean, Tracy, you work with these companies and try and advocate for them. I mean, do you find it difficult to convince them of what Bridget says in terms of like making sure that they do keep humanity at the core, that they are over reliant on this sort of stuff?
I think these companies, these big tech companies, they do have good people who work at them and want to do good, and they are human and understand humanity in that sense. I think one of the risks right now is that a lot of the people who work at these companies belong to pretty homogenous cohorts, and despite trying to do good, often have pretty big blind spots. And that can be because many of these people are not trained in humanities thinking or thinking beyond the immediate technology they're working on. And some of it is a lack of demographic diversity. So really understanding what is meaningful to their demographics, but not understanding what the implications might be for others. And so these blind spots can end up being painful when there are examples of things like Facebook sending reminders of here, your most liked photograph in the last year, and it might be of a child that passed away, and that's very painful. It was meant to be here, happy memories from the last year, but sometimes they just miss out on what the use case might end up being. And in other cases, it can be very insidious when there are impacts that spiral out of control. So you can see like the spread of misinformation or the weaponization of social media to spread misinformation, disinformation. So despite good intentions, I think we still have a lot of blind spots that need to be addressed. And I think sometimes people who think that they're doing good but don't understand what they're missing can get very defensive and feel like, well, technology is always progress, and we're not going to stand against progress. And that leads to sometimes destructive effects on community. Like if you look at Uber or these like car services that now employ millions of drivers, but are also working very hard to get to self-driving cars so that they can actually be profitable. When they are able to make that transition, there will be many drivers who will be out of jobs, and they're not thinking about what that impact is going to be because they're very narrowly focused on, let's try to achieve self-driving cars.
And that's the interesting thing, because these, even any AI development still requires human input. So, I mean, Oren, how does the human interface with the AI at the minute, and how sort of does that relationship work? Is it a sort of back and forth, or is it that humanity is essentially populating and creating this AI?
So, great question and a complex topic. Let me just highlight a couple of points. The first one is I like to think of AI as augmented intelligence, because when we have the positive outcomes, it's when we have the tool being used by people in a good way. So one example, of course, is just the Google search engine, which most of us use, and it has a number of AI systems in it. If you're using the Google translation tool. So again, you're using it the same way that you use a calculator. And when we have, for example, what's called autonomous vehicles, and those will arrive gradually over time, we have the potential to right another wrong of technology, which is in the United States, over 40,000 people die each year in car accidents on the highways. Over 1 million people are injured. And the estimates are that as much as 80% of that could be prevented with this kind of AI technology. So again, we will have that be good. It's still going to be the case, of course, that the people tell the cars where to go, right? It's not like the cars take over and all the cars say, okay, we're going to do Brexit, we're going to leave the EU or something like that. So in all these situations, I think when the system works well is when it's augmented intelligence. Of course, there are also plenty of situations, some that Tracy alluded to, and in the criminal justice system and other ones, where that connection between people and AI isn't done right. People are overly subservient to the technology. They listen to it too much, and then it works quite badly. So I like to advocate that we think of AI as augmented intelligence, and we think about how to use it to build a better society.
And do you think that it can be used, therefore, Bridget, to AI to build a better leadership model as well? Can AI be used to help decision makers be a bit more human, perversely?
It can help decision makers definitely, but it depends on, if you look at today what is happening with the masses in terms of information and manipulation of data and things like that. So it depends upon accountability, transparency, and having the right purpose. What do I want to do? What do I want to achieve? And it's things like that.
And I mean, and we also, I mean, you touched a bit, Tracy, on the labour market aspect. We do have a question from Megan on Slido, which is, do we need to think more carefully before sort of running headlong into adopting AI of the potential impact on, employment and society and things like that? Do we need a sort of overarching AI strategy? And if so, what would that look like, do you think? Again, another big question, sorry.
25 words or less.
Yeah. Dory, we have until 5:15. We can talk as long as we want.
Ideally, we would have an AI strategy that considers what the implications might be, but I think very realistically, the technology development is just running so quickly ahead of where we can be in terms of even like discussion, but definitely very far ahead of regulation and policy. And I don't think it's realistic to say we need to craft our whole strategy before we start implementing more AI. I think the other thing that makes it impossible is that we don't actually know what AI will be capable of. Even, I think, let's see, 7 or 8 years ago, the deep learning was not yet working. And I still remember actually when I studied AI machine learning in my master's program, we just skipped over the whole neural net section because my professor, Andrew Ng, said, oh, like we tried this a few decades ago and it didn't work, so we're just skipping over it. We're just not going to cover it. And then in 2012, they actually did manage to make neural nets work, and now that's the whole craze around deep learning, and it's really propelled computer vision to new levels. And some of that was because of the increase in compute power and data. And so things that we thought even 10 years ago are not going to work actually have completely transformed AI now. And so just because it's so difficult to predict where we're going to go, it also makes it impossible to design strategy around it.
Um, I very much agree. There's so many races, military and economic, we can't stop. I just wanted to highlight one piece with a metaphor of an old professor of mine, Herb Simon, who won the Nobel Prize in Economics and the Turing Award in Computer Science. I think he's one of the most illustrated intellectuals of all time. And there's a parable called Simon's Ant. Ant not as in family member, but as in the little critter. And if you were to draw the graph of an ant walking on a beach, you'll see an extremely complex and convoluted path. It's difficult to predict or to model. Yet the ant is a very, very simple creature. So how is that possible? And the answer is, well, the ant is responding to local stimuli, right? Going up the little sand dunes and responding to where the sun is and so on. Now, how is this relevant here? It's relevant because, as Tracy said earlier, right, these algorithms are in some sense dumb, or in some sense, simple. They've been around for certainly since the 50s and 60s in various variations. So how is this possible? Well, again, what's happened in around 2012, with some successes, this really crystallized a combination of tremendous compute power and tremendous data fed into these relatively simple algorithms resulted in success. So this is what we're seeing today. And at the same time, I just want to reiterate, these are narrow successes, right? We still don't have an AI system that's nearly as capable as my 8-year-old boy, for example, or really any child 5 or 6 years old is still a lot more sophisticated as a generalist compared to any AI system.
Yeah, go ahead.
I think that companies should be reskilling and upskilling workers. But right now there's no massive strategy with this. When change happens, it's difficult for people. Nobody likes change. So right now, employers should be preparing employees for change. Your job is not permanent. Change is coming. And when that change comes, go about it in a humane way. For example, John comes to work after 18 years working in a company, and they told him he no longer has a job. Security escorts him out the building. What could they have done differently? Could they have been more humane in the process? We can't understand what you're going through, but we are here to help. We can offer counseling. We can help you with resume writing, interviewing. Do you need a recommendation? What can we do to help? This is happening. We cannot change because job disruption is going to happen. But how do we handle it to prepare people for it? And it doesn't take much, to be human. It's not like a hard thing. It's the simple things that we do that counts the most. The kind word, the thoughtful gesture that impacts people and will remain with them.
So how do we keep that in cold, hard computer logic then? How do we make sure we don't lose that moral grounding?
Well, one idea that I wrote a little while ago in Wired magazine, if you want to look it up, was specifically related to the labor markets and these ideas. And I pointed out that the place that computers and AI systems will get to last in some sense is human empathy, very much the sort of thing you were saying, Bridget. And so if we were willing to invest in a society more resources in delivering food to the elderly and in care for autistic children and just care for the weakest members in society, we could actually employ people who are displaced by the rapid change in the technology in that capacity. And it's actually the weakest members of society, right? People who, say, didn't finish high school, didn't finish college, may struggle with, upscaling programs. People talked about, coal miners to data miners, right? But that's not realistic. How many of our coal miners are going to become data miners? But perhaps they can be there to care for members of society. And this is not a simple thing, but if we could do that, I think that would be a powerful transition.
And Tracy, I think you worked with the Bureau of Labor Statistics in the US at some point. Did you?
I didn't work with them, but I have looked at the data they've
Oh, okay,
collected.
sorry.
Yes.
Well, so, but more generally, in terms of, I guess, preparing us for these changes, what can we do to kind of, as Oren says, to get people prepared for a world where AI and humans really do coexist?
This is an area where I don't have any answers. I do have some questions. And one big space of questions is around capitalism and what we value. And so this question around upskilling workers that are going to be displaced, I'm not sure who has that responsibility. Ideally, we are all human and humane and want to take care of each other, but in a capitalist society where the overarching motive is the profit motive, it doesn't necessarily make sense for corporations to be upskilling people. It just makes sense profit-wise to switch over to the robots when they're available. And there are a lot of jobs that rely more on empathy and humanity. But these are ones that our society right now does not value very much. If you look at how much caretakers are paid, it's pretty much the bottom. So this is maybe not so much capitalism as it is potentially misogyny, since a lot of these jobs are coded as more feminine, and jobs that are more feminine are usually valued less. And there's a lot of research on this over many different industries, like when more men move into a field and it becomes viewed as more masculine and lucrative, yeah, the women get pushed out. So there's a lot of things swirling around this. I don't actually have any good answers. I do think we should be looking at these jobs that will be difficult for machines to do and figure out how to support people in those jobs.
Yes, I agree with you there. But also governments, institutions, but also it comes back to the individual. You can't wait and say, well, it depends upon them. This is your life. So I tell individuals, take charge. Keep abreast of the information, what is going on. There are free courses you can learn online that Microsoft and these companies at least have some basic knowledge. Look at your skills. What skills cannot be easily automated in this digital age? What peripheral skills do you have? What are your strengths? What are your passions? What do you like to do? And also network. It's about connecting and building relationships.
And Tracy touched on a really interesting point there, which is kind of the implicit biases and how AI reflects human biases. I mean, Oren, how do we iron out basically perpetuating things like gender bias? I mean, we saw in relatively recent months Amazon's automatic filtering of job applicants that just completely blanked out women.
Right. So let me start by just explaining this issue, because it is a very serious issue. So these programs that we've been talking about, whether they're deep learning neural network models or other ones, all have this characteristic that they take data from the past, they collect it and build models in the present and use these to make predictions or future decisions. Now, the problem with this story is if the data from the past capture biases that we had in the past, whether they're sexist or racist or what have you, and we no longer find those acceptable, they're going to be carried over by the technology into the future. What's worse is the technology seeks to find patterns in the data, and so they can generalize and amplify the biases. So at the end of this process, the bias is even worse than it was before. The good news about this is that we do, first of all, there's very strong awareness now in the technical community about this issue, and I think most things do not have technical solutions, but here at least part of this does. So we are increasingly aware of tools that we can use to mitigate that, whether by augmenting the data, changing the data, or whether by changing what's called the loss function, basically changing the algorithm to at least mitigate that to some extent. At the end of the day, though, the key is to have people be aware, don't accept, caveat emptor, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, don't accept what the machine spits out at face value, right? You have to very carefully audit and try to understand. is this reliable? Is this high quality? Does this contain biases?
I mean, has the AI revolution actually oddly highlighted some of the wider issues in society, do you think, Tracy? Like when it's in black and white that robots that are designed to mimic human behavior perpetuate biases, do we then sort of have more of a stark view on this?
Yeah, I do think it is easier to quantify some of that now, and you can actually test out an algorithm by putting an image in front of it and asking it to classify it. So it's a little bit easier to test. Um, but yeah, I would also say like there's been bias for a long time and people have talked about it for a long time, so it's not as if we didn't know that these things existed. I do think there's a general shift in conversation very broadly. It's not necessarily specifically just from AI highlighting some of these issues now.
And in terms of shifts of conversation, I mean, I think probably the majority of this debate has been relatively negative and bashing AI for a bit. I mean, how do we, because it is potentially something that is an enormous public good, how do we shift the conversation about this and make it more about AI's powerful abilities to change the world?
Well, Chris, I'm glad you asked that question, since we did have some exchange before. So our mission is AI for the common good, and I do see enormous potential benefits. And I think one of the biggest ways that we can shift the conversation is to deliver some of those benefits, whether they're, as I mentioned, in cars and fewer accidents, which is already starting to happen with safety devices in cars that are based on AI, whether it's in the medical systems, where in the United States at least, the third leading cause of death in American hospitals is physician error. And again, information systems and AI systems can help reduce that. At the Allen Institute for Artificial Intelligence, we're building search engines free search engines for scientists and researchers that hopefully make them more efficient in doing their science, and that will hopefully help us whether we're trying to deal with climate change or superbugs or whatever the intellectual and technical challenges of the day. So I think as we deliver these high quality, beneficial applications will make a difference. I do want to make one point about bias before I end there. Generally, so far, right, it has been negative. But again, as Tracy pointed out, bias is part of the human condition. And one interesting thing about bias when we see it in people is they tend to lie about it. Right? Whereas our AI systems, at least unless they're designed to lie, won't. They're more able to stick to a set of rules and a set of constraints. So the potential in AI systems, if we design them in the right way, is to reduce bias, to note when bias exists in human behavior. For example, say black, defendants of color are treated differently than defendants of the white race and so on. So I think the potential is there for a lot of good. We just have to build the systems the right way.
Yeah, I want to add on to that just a little bit, build on what Oren was saying. There are people who are looking at how to correct for biases that we don't want to see in these systems that we're building. So in one example, they're looking at correlations of words where male is more often associated with doctor and female with nurse. But knowing that this bias existed meant that the people developing the models could actually go in and zero out those correlations, which is very promising. So if you tell somebody, or even if somebody acknowledges that they are biased and say, yes, I am sexist because I live in society and I have picked up cues from society, it's very difficult to correct for that. And so even when humans are very aware and trying to address it, it's very difficult to fix, whereas in the machine learning models, you can actually go zero out those biases.
Let me give just a really concrete example of what Tracy was saying that we've thought about. We haven't built this, but I hope that we will. So again, unconscious bias in job applications is well known. We currently do not have a way of stripping gender characteristics from resumes. You can take out the names, you can take out the pictures, but then, president of the women's rowing club or whatever it is, it's pretty easy to tell a person's gender from a standard resume. Well, we can build models, right? Where the models would strip away that information automatically, and when the resume is presented to the recruiter, it can be very difficult to tell the gender or the race of the person. And that would actually be a learning problem, right? Build something that makes it as difficult as possible or impossible to tell the person's characteristics that you want to obscure and then give the resume to people. So that's a great example of what you were saying in a very concrete context that would make a difference.
I want to respond to that very quickly, which is that is very powerful that we could strip those identifying characteristics. The next question I would have is, does that actually improve the screening process? Because actually in some cases when I've reviewed resumes, if I see that someone, let's say someone is a Black woman and they're still in tech, I feel like they must have faced much more obstacles, and the fact that they're still around is probably a positive signal on their tenacity and ability to stick it out in an unfriendly environment. And so I may actually want to know some of those details in some cases because it contextualizes. And the prestige of university, like there's bias in who has access to certain universities or can afford to pay for them. And so if somebody has stuck it out through a state college and managed to still become very successful, that sort of distance traveled metric is very powerful. And so even if we could remove all the information, I'm not sure that I always would. But there are actually still interesting ways of doing kind of a candidate screening that could address some of these issues in a different way. So I know some people who are working on predictors of job performance that are based on more psychometric fingerprint type of details. So if you play a game, you can start to assess different characteristics of how somebody approaches problem solving, and that can be very independent of gender, race, or a lot of these other superficial characteristics, but can be correlated to success metrics in a specific workplace. And so then you could have people who are candidates play those games. It doesn't really matter what their resume says, but if they have the sort of psychometric fingerprint that matches to high performers in the specific job, then they are better candidates to hire.
I presume, Bridget, as someone trying to improve the quality of our leadership, that gets you very excited. It does, hopefully. Does it? The use of AI, brill, good. We are in our last sort of 10 minutes or so, so I just wanted to see if anybody from our audience had any questions. Oh, we do. Brilliant. Fantastic. We've got 3. There you go. Yes, we'll start with that gentleman there.
Thank you. My name is Walter Kloringhofen. I work at NATO, and I have a question that goes in a completely different direction.
Mike is not on.
Okay, thank you. So my question addresses something completely different. It's about the future of warfare. We discussed that yesterday. So essentially, AI will be a very important component of future warfare, especially when you think about a possible conflict with a dictatorship, authoritarian regime. How much human decision making or power do you think will be left in the future on the military level or even the political level? Is there any hope?
Well, this is something that I've written about, and of course, I don't have a crystal ball, but I'd like to make a conceptual distinction that I do think is important here, and that's the distinction between intelligence and autonomy. And we're used to people who, of course, are both, and so it's easy to conflate those. But I would argue that we can have increasingly intelligent weapons in the sense that they're more targeted, potentially more powerful, and that has its own mixed dynamic, right? More targeted might reduce civilian casualties. More powerful is always a scary thing if you think of incredibly powerful cyber weapons. But I do think that's somewhat inevitable simply because of the dynamics of the arms race. But the autonomy question, which is the second part of what you raised, is a completely separate thing. So as we have increasingly intelligent weapons, we can retain the control of these weapons in the hands of humans. And I personally, even though humans have their own weaknesses, certainly feel more comfortable that way, that people are still the ones making the decisions. So I just want to draw that distinction and at least argue that it's possible to separate those two dimensions.
Speed is an important issue.
Yes. So just as an example, in a defensive context, right, Israel has deployed weapons to defend against, the indiscriminate shelling of civilian population centers by Palestinians and others. And in that context, right, there is no human in the loop. It's a purely defensive measure. In other situations, you do lose some speed, but on the other hand, you can gain in accuracy, right? So it is a choice, but I think we can draw the line there. We'll leave some speed, but we will still have the authority for taking human life rest with a person.
I think we have one question at the back there as well.
Yeah. So what do you tell people, when they look at systems? I mean, the current crop of systems in the current wave, they produce systems which are basically totally opaque, right? So you have no way to look inside the current type of systems, not like in the old days we had rule-based systems you could look inside. I mean, that was fine. So these systems are totally unexplainable. They're totally opaque. And there's actually no really convincing way to do verification, validation, test, and evaluation of a system when you can't actually ever look inside. I mean, you can make a guess, but that's about it. So what do you tell people when they say, okay, if I'm going to put it in a critical situation, what about that?
So 2 points. One is actually 3 points very quickly. One is, even in the old days of rule-based systems, right, when you had a large set of rules, there was a bunch of opacity there, particularly in the interactions between them. So we were younger in the past, but it wasn't always so much better. Point one. Point two, people are working on more explainable systems. You're absolutely right. It's extremely difficult with these nonlinear neural networks. But the third piece, which is actually where I have the most hope, is externally auditing them. So what you can do, even if the system is relatively a black box, you can fire at it literally hundreds of thousands, if not millions of cases, and see how it's loan processing or criminal justice or weapons behavior. And this external auditing can give you a model of how the system will behave. So I believe that we're going to have increasingly sophisticated auditing system, and that will help.
One thing I would add as a flip side to being able to peer into some of these systems is that if they are being used in contexts that may become adversarial, having too much visibility is dangerous. So there are some of these computer vision systems now that can be very easily tricked just by adding in a few pixels in the right places, which is kind of fun for now. You could put on one of these like stickers and then confuse the computer vision algorithms. But if you wanted to use these, let's say in defense applications, you don't necessarily want the adversary to be able to trick your system. So I'm not saying that we shouldn't have interpretable systems, and we definitely should try to understand more what is going to be the output with certain inputs, but that's another consideration, which is like, how can they be weaponized? You can see this in more, I guess, like the civilian or commercial context with like Google search. So Google is very protective of what inputs are being used and how they're being combined to do search results, because you always have people trying to rise to the top. That's like the whole domain of SEO. So people are, they used to do really simplistic things like keyword stuffing to get the results to rise to the top, but then you have these spammers and fraudsters who are trying to rise to the top. So Google has to be very protective there. So it's just a very difficult thing to advocate for true transparency.
On the other hand, you can have a system, you can have something which is subject to adversarial attack. But on the other hand, if you don't really know what's happening in a system, the attack may not be adversarial or intentional. Maybe if you're running a system in a natural environment, you're subject to, you have no idea what exactly. So it's not only adversarial attacks, it's also just natural occurrences. Can screw you up just as badly.
I mean, we've seen Facebook and Twitter get weaponized, and I don't think they even fully understood what they were getting used for.
We had a gentleman at the front, two gentlemen at the front here, and then we'll go to the back. So these two people here first. Thank you.
Could we have a woman ask a question?
Yeah,
after
I was hoping that we could.
I can
waiting
make
for people to put their hands
I
up.
can make maybe a lady's voice, if that would make somebody happier. I'm Victor Such from the GOBSEC Policy Institute. I really like the examples of the benefits, if I may go back to that question. But they sort of make me feel they are a little bit more statistical when we talked about the reducing number of incidents, whether they're car incidents or incidents that happen in surgeries. because they're basically also non-events, aren't they? If something doesn't happen to you, you might not register it on a personal level. So I was just wondering if the trick to make the conversation, shift towards the benefits of the AI also in argumenting maybe the experience. For instance, in cars, it would be the luxury of not having to pay attention, that you can, it's more comfortable, you can be focusing on other things. Or would there be other examples of benefits that would register more on individual or more personal level?
Individual
Sorry for a
benefits.
difficult question there.
What is the best way of, how can we reduce friction, I guess, here?
I mean, I like your suggestion of making it more personal. I don't have much to add.
Okay, bro. We have an AI developer there, I think, basically. Yes.
Hello, thank you for your insight so far. So my name is David and I work for Google in protecting elections actually. So it's a bit maybe not so relevant in this discussion. However, my question is connected to, I think, what Tracy mentioned. When we speak about AI, I think AI will increase the discrepancies between the haves and the have-nots. And for the have-nots, what do you think will be a solution when AI will potentially displace them for their jobs? Do you believe in a universal basic income? Is this an option, or taxing robots? How do you foresee a future in which there will be for sure people that will be, let's say, not benefiting from AI as some of the other groups of people? How will we help them? That's my question. Thank you.
I mean, I'm personally an advocate for the universal basic income, but that's just as a human rather than necessarily as anything connected to AI. I mean, how do we have talked about this. People do get left behind in these technological revolutions. So how do you prevent that?
It is a complex issue. I would just make a couple of points. One is universal basic income, at least in the United States, is not practical. We haven't even though we're a very rich society, we haven't even been able to deliver universal health care. So I think just as a practical matter, we may need a different solution. I also think that the problem with taxing robots, on the one hand, it seems sensible, right? Then we could use that income to deliver social programs. You tend to tax things that you want less of, right? Like a sin tax, right? We tax cigarettes, we tax alcohol. It's unclear whether we want fewer robots or not, because again, that puts us somewhat at a disadvantage internationally. So I'm just concerned about those two solutions for different reasons. The one thing that I do like is if we were to provide tax credits to people for or other benefits for improving their education, for working. And so if we can provide incentives for positive behaviors, that strikes me as something that would be perhaps more practical than universal basic income, and perhaps promote positive things rather than tax robots. But I don't have an answer, and the problem is absolutely a big one. The last point I want to make real quick is that this is part of a trend that's been taking place over some decades, right? So where did all these Uber drivers come from, right? They were displaced from other positions. Amazon and e-commerce, even without AI, is already creating, loss of jobs in the retail sector. So we've had some decades of these trends, and they're going to continue. We need to do something about it that's broader than just dealing with AI. It's really about digitization and automation.
Great. We have a question at the back.
Yes, since we're in the overarching theme is navigating through disruptions, can we sort of talk about the global political implications in terms of the disruptions across countries like China, India, Estonia as one element, and Pakistan, and the implications of how those disruptions will be managed, and your sense of the scale and impact of the disruptions as it affects countries differently, and democracies versus authoritarian regimes, and the ability to respond to those disruptions?
So this is the AI arms race, I guess, right? Who's going to win out of this? China? Oh, okay.
The question is, there are clearly going to be disruptions that may affect more populous countries than, say, Estonia versus India and China. And so if you have a lot of people and they're out of work because of the disruptions of technology, there are greater political and social implications. May or may not be true. So the question is anyone thinking about that? How do you manage it? And those disruptions, as Tracy said, policy is not going to be ahead of it, it's going to be behind it. So the disruptions and dislocations are going to be here, and the implications are going to be here, and are going to be not evenly felt across countries. What are you guys thinking about that?
Again, very sweeping question and a good one. Let me offer a partial answer just in the hopes of giving my co-panelists a chance to think. I don't know that anybody has an adequate answer, but 2 points. Something that's working well, and I hope we continue to preserve it, is the open dissemination of information across universities, open source, archive, and so on. So even as tensions between the US and China and other tensions are inflamed, so far there has not been an attempt to curtail the exchange of information in academic forums. And I hope that continues, and that of course gives smaller players equal access to the sort of, the papers, the open source code, the open source data, etc. So I think that's a good thing. Something that I think is a huge negative, both because of lack of cross-fertilization and also simply weakens the United States. I do think we have increasingly adversarial relationship with China, is the restraints on immigration. We have fewer and fewer people applying to our undergrad programs, to our graduate programs from outside of the United States. We have fewer people being allowed to stay due to a variety of measures that the Trump administration has taken. And the result of that is a real negative for artificial intelligence in the United States. And that's something I hope that we reverse. Put in plain terms, we need more visas for people to study AI and to be part of the AI ecosystem in the United States. We need more visas rather than less.
I was a little bit hesitant to answer because I don't feel like I'm a good enough student of geopolitics and society to give a good answer, but I'll also offer some thoughts on where technology and AI are potentially going to cause disruption in bad ways. So with technology independent of AI, if we're looking at some of the big companies like Google, Facebook, Uber, they're starting to provide services across the world, but all of the wealth concentration, all that power concentration is still primarily in those companies in Silicon Valley or in the United States. So they control the algorithms that determine who sees what, who can connect with whom. The economics, so for Uber, the economics of providing the service across the world have primarily concentrated in San Francisco. So when we look at then AI, it gets even more powerful. It's no longer just the technology, the data, the compute, but the data part of it becomes an even bigger concentrator of that power. And we're seeing it primarily in the US and in China, and there are not any other very compelling players. So now we have a little bit of this arms race between the US and China. As Oren mentioned, the US is doing some really dumb things around immigration that it's going to hurt it. At a very high level, right now, China is getting much better at execution on AI. The US is still very good at R&D, but potentially is going to lose out going forward. So then if we end up in a world where China holds most of the power around AI and these technology products are used around the world, they can then control the technology that's used by all these other countries. So now we're not even just looking at disruptions within individual countries, but at a global scale, we have a change of power where China may be even more influential. It's already been very influential in terms of like the trade and economics. But if it can control all the technology as well, then other countries around the world may just have to be beholden to what China wants to do. Then we also have the issues like within each country, if they're not able to control their own destiny with technology, what happens? I don't have real answers around what we do about growing income inequality or wealth inequality. But I think the questions we were grappling with earlier around like how do we reskill people or put them into positions where they can still live in the absence of the jobs that they had previously, like we still need to figure out all of those questions.
And speaking of questions, we are basically out of time. We started a little late, so we'll end a little late. One very, very, very brief answer from each of you. What is the development that you're most excited for, the use case of AI in the future? So we'll start with Oren, we'll go down the line.
Autonomous vehicles, because they have the potential to save just so many lives.
Bridget?
Healthcare, because I think as humans, the basic thing we all want is health and better health.
And Tracy?
I think better understanding of people. So we're starting to collect more data on people and workforces and how they interact. And I think if we have a better understanding of the humans that are involved, hopefully we can make better decisions around how to treat people as well.
I think that's a good manifesto for life. Thank you very much for all of your inputs, and thank you very much for joining us. Hope that you enjoy your coffee break.
And thank you, Chris, for being a great
Thank you, Chris.
moderator.